Think about improvisation in movies and chances are your mind goes to comedies like Anchorman or quick-witted dudes like Ryan Reynolds. Horror, however, is not so well known for the off-the-cuff spontaneity. I mean, a genre full of sharp things like blood and guts means it requires a certain amount of careful planning. That's not to say though that horror is completely scared of making things up on the spot. It might be rarer than a comedy, but some of horror's most quotable lines and memorable sequences were completely unscripted. Just look at these 10 classic horror moments that were ad-libbed on the spot to see the lasting impact of a little improvisation. I am Marcus Bronzy, this is What Culture, and it's time to chew bubblegum and ad-lib one-liners. And guess what? I'm all out of gum. Here are 10 famous horror movie moments that were completely improvised. Number 10, the helicopter crash in Attack of the Killer Tomatoes. This B-movie about a salad ingredient gone bad may not have acquired quite the same classic status as some of the others on this list, but it did kickstart a genuine multimedia franchise with George Clooney starring in a sequel, an animated TV series and more than one video game. It also contains one of the most audacious pieces of improv in horror movie history. Killer Tomatoes was a predictably low-cost affair, but they did manage to scrape together the funds to hire a helicopter to land in the background scene of some cops that were gunning down a mutant veg. But as the little chopper came into land, it spun wildly out of control and crashed in the field. The film's budget was barely 6 figures. A chopper of that type probably cost about 60 grand. So the cameras kept rolling and they got some unexpectedly dramatic crash footage. How could they not throw that into the movie? It cost a bomb. Well, it cost a helicopter, but you know what I mean. Over the years, the crash has become one of cult movies' most memorable scenes, an unexpectedly real action stunt in a cheap nonsense parody. Number 9, that brutal ending, Witchfinder General. This cult English Civil War folk horror is best remembered for its shockingly abrupt, brutal ending scene, in which Ian Ogilvy's round-headed soldier savagely hacks the evil Witchfinder to pieces in a fit of vengeful madness. As originally scripted, however, the film would have had a more conventional ending reflecting that of the source novel. Vincent Price's Witchfinder would have been dealt the same cruel fate he'd given to others, and be executed in a moment of karmic justice. The planned sequence, which involved a whole camp full of extras, was deemed far too costly by the producer Tony Tenser. With Price due to start his run on Broadway musical Darling of the Day, a new ending had to be pulled together on the spot. This led director Michael Reeves to the far smaller and more downbeat ending with which we're now familiar. With soldiers rushing in at the last minute to put the axe-damaged Witchfinder out of misery with a gunshot, Ogilvy had one moment of improvisation. He let out an agonised howl at being robbed of taking personal vengeance. It's this ad-libbed primal scream at a world gone mad that is the final lingering sense the movie leaves you with. Number 8, Frank Hellraiser. Hellraiser was Clive Barker's directional debut and adaptation of his own novella, The Hellbound Heart. Fortunately, even whilst adapting his own work, the first time Helmer was never too precious about the final cut matching his original script. Whilst Pinhead and his gang quickly established themselves, the real monster of Hellraiser is teen heroine Kirsty's creepy Uncle Frank. Many of the moments that made Frank memorable, though, were made up on the spot. An iconic shot of a skinless Frank smoking a cigarette came about because Barker spotted actor Oliver Smith enjoying a cheeky ciggy in a full skinless makeup between takes. Barker liked it, so he decided to chuck it in the movie. Meanwhile, once clad in the skin of his brother Larry, many of Frank's best-known lines were made up on the spot by the actor Andrew Robinson. Enough of this cat and mouse shit was one that Robinson ad-libbed unprompted and Barker happily left in. Most memorably though, the actor took his final line, a simplistic "f off," and improvised it with a much more evocative "Jesus wept." Now that's the way to sign off before you get torn apart. Number 7. You hit me with a phone! Scream. As a knowing parody of all of the slasher horrors, Scream was only too keen to show that sometimes everything doesn't go quite smoothly for a real killer as it does for Jason or Michael Myers. That means if actors fluff something, the director Wes Craven had no qualms about leaving it in the final cut. Case in point, one of the phones used by the killers to torment their victims with their impromptu slasher trivia quizzes, actor Skeet Ulrich was aiming to slam a phone down on a countertop, but thanks to his hands being covered in murderous blood, well, it slipped and smacked into the back of co-star Matthew Lillard's head. Staying in character, Lillard's improvised a response and snapped back, "You hit me with a phone, you..." It was this take that Craven left in the movie as is and really showed that the criminal genius killers were just a couple of idiot high schoolers. For good measure, another ad-lib from Lillard was when he suddenly blurts at Neve Campbell's Sydney while she's calling the cops on him for murder. "My mum and dad are gonna be so mad at me." Also made it into the final cut, helping make the character a more memorable screw-up than originally scripted. Number 6, chewing bubblegum and kicking ass. They live. The history of wrestlers on film is a decidedly mixed bag. For every Dwayne Johnson becoming his generation's most insanely charismatic action star, pulling in the big bucks, there's a Hulk Hogan as Mr. Nanny. One thing you do get when casting a wrestler is a knack for killer one-liners, and that's exactly what Rowdy Roddy Piper brought to John Carpenter's satirical, anti-consumerist alien occupation picture. Even people who have never seen They Live know the moment where Piper's John Nada strides into a bank wielding a shotgun and says, "I'm here to chew bubblegum and kick ass, and I'm all out of bubblegum." And even those who don't know the scene will recognise the line from a long pop cultural afterlife that has included being appropriated by Duke Nukem. Piper has said that it was just some nonsense that he came up with in the moment, while Carpenter on the other hand suggested that he had picked the line out of the wrestler's notebook, full of potential trash talk lines. Either way, Piper's addition to the script is what really made it zing. Number 5, Game Over Man, Aliens. When it comes to facing off against the most terrifying monsters in sci-fi horror, we'd all like to believe we'd be like Ripley, hyper-competent and kick-ass. In truth, most of us would follow a more private Hudson path from cockiness to complete shambles. In fact, Bill Paxton's Hudson is essentially Alien's audience surrogate. As such, his express elevator to hell has all the best lines. Hudson's freakout as the Colonial's Marines' escape is cut off by the crash of a dropship was completely improvised by the actor, including infamously announcing, "Game over, man, game over." Paxton reasoned that the character would have grown up as a gamer, so this would be his cultural reference point for when things turned really bad. Gamer or not, it doesn't stop Paxton's ad-lib from resonating with audiences across the years. Number 4, Hannibal Lecter's terrifying brilliance, The Silence of the Lambs. The Silence of the Lambs was not the first Hannibal Lecter movie, but it was the one that established the character as one of the all-time great movie monsters, winning a rare horror movie acting Oscar along the way. Much of that is down to Anthony Hopkins' superb performance of the caged menace. Hopkins brought a lot to the role of the cannibal, including some things that weren't in the script. In the scene in which he puts on a mocking impression of Jodie Foster's southern accent, for example, that was a decision made by Hopkins on the spot. And because of that, Foster's reaction is more authentic, as she had not been expecting Hopkins to go there. In fact, Foster said that she had found Hopkins genuinely scary during the filming of those scenes, something that gave their iconic interplay an additional friction. Most memorably though, Hopkins added a bizarre hissing noise after delivering Lecter's famous line about eating someone's liver with fava beans and a nice glass of wine. Watching this scene, you can even see Hopkins pause between saying Chianti and the hiss, giving the director a chance to cut if he wanted. It seemed like that unsettling hissing noise really set the tone, and they left it in, and good that they did, because it's hard to think of that reference or any kind of parody around it without that noise. Number 3, here's Johnny, The Shining. Infamously unpopular with the writer Stephen King, Kubrick's film version of The Shining has nevertheless gained iconic horror status, in part due to Jack Nicholson's manic lead performance. Nicholson's randomly exclaiming "Here's Johnny" was taken from the introduction of Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, which had run since the early 1960s, but it was just one of several things that the actor had tried during 3 days of takes for the notoriously perfectionist Kubrick, smashing about 60 doors in the process. The director, not exactly a big chat show viewer, reportedly didn't even get the reference, but put it in the movie anyway. Kubrick wasn't the only one, as the line would develop a life of its own beyond its origin, appealing to people who had never seen or heard of Carson. Number 2, You're Gonna Need a Bigger Boat, Jaws. You're Gonna Need a Bigger Boat rapidly entered the pop culture lexicon after Police Chief Brody understatedly responded to his first proper sight of the full scale of Jaws' gigantic great white shark. Before that though, the line had already been a sort of mimetic in-joke among the movie's cast and crew. On top of all the other problems that made filming at sea such a nightmare, Jaws' stingy producers would only stump up the cash for a tiny support boat. This had led to "You're Gonna Need a Bigger Boat" becoming an on-set catchphrase whenever the latest crisis hit. Lead actor Roy Scheider was a particular fan of the phrase and tried to frequently insert the dialogue into different scenes throughout the movie. Credit must also go to Oscar-winning editor Verna Field. As to Scheider, she was the one to spot the perfect alignment of the actor's favourite ad-lib and the best possible place for it in the movie. Proof that even the best moments of on-screen, on-the-spot brilliance still need some post-production assistance. Number 1. Basically everything in the Blair Witch Project. There are horrors where lines or moments of action are improvised on the spot, but a horror that's almost entirely improvised? Well, that's a whole lot rarer. Still, that's just one way in which, love it or hate it, Blair Witch changed the game for horror cinema. The production began with just a 35-page outline, no regular script, and no dialogue. From the interviews with the locals that began the movie, with real unscripted conversations with the actual townspeople of Burkesville, Maryland, to the chilling final shots, huge amounts of the actual content of the Blair Witch Project were made up on the fly. The 3 lead actors were really just sent into the woods with cameras, and each morning they would receive an outline of what their character should do. Beyond that, all their dialogue and actions were improvised. It all gave a sense of authenticity and genuine tension, especially as tempers frayed and it became increasingly difficult to tell how much of the fraught arguments between the trio was simply improvised acting. For that famous ending, directors Daniel Merrick and Eduardo Sanchez hadn't actually decided what to do when the shoot began. By the time it came to the film's climax, actor Michael C. Williams was just told to abandon the terrified co-star Heather Donahue and run into the creepy house. Then, a producer tackled him to the floor and shoved him in a basement in the corner just in time for Heather and her camera to stumble into this unexpected scene and give a real natural reaction. Plenty of later horrors tried to recapture what made Blair Witch such a hit, with varying degrees of success. Few, though, committed quite so much to the sense of naturally occurring fear that comes from almost total improvisation. So, there you go. I am Marcus Bronzy, and that was 10 famous horror movie moments that were completely improvised. Got something to add to the convo? Well, let us know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe. Don't forget to do that. You can find us on social media at WhatCulture. I'm on all social medias as well, at Marcus Bronzy, MarcusBronzy, at twitch.tv/Marcus Bronzy on weekdays, and my podcast called Ain't Got a Clue. Get that wherever you listen to those. Until next time, peace.